Hello and welcome to episode 14 of the Energy Transition Now podcast. You will of course see and hear that I'm indeed not David Linden. I am Gareth Hector, Head of Marketing here at Westwood. Now, in a change to our normal lineup, this week we turned the tables and a few days ago I caught up with David in our London office for a look and listen back to Series 1 and Series 2. I've asked David about key themes that have come out of the episodes and any key highlights that he'd like to replay during this episode. So take a listen, take a look, and if you have any feedback, do of course get in touch with us. Enjoy. So, David, a warm welcome to your own podcast.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So it made sense for us to come together today for this episode to have a look back over Series 1 and Series 2. It's been quite a few months now we've been running them. We've covered a lot of different topics and it's really been quite a busy schedule.
Absolutely. No, certainly it's always busy getting everyone's diaries aligned and making sure we can all speak. And I'm hugely grateful for folks who have taken the time to do that. I think we've all learned a lot and certainly throughout the series, but in particular, I guess, in Series 2, you've even seen the passion, but also the opportunity come out of the change that we need to make and the way that we can achieve that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think as we're now entering the second week of COP, it might be quite a nice idea for us to have a think back and from your point of view, what themes do you think have really come through over the latest episodes, what perhaps has stood out for you, and then we can have a listen back to some of those.
Absolutely, no, happy to. We can take a step back. I mean, Series 1 and 2 were sort of slightly different in the sense that what we were trying to cover in Series 1 was kind of the context from an operator perspective. Why do you need to change, I guess? And in Series 2 is trying to look a little bit more at the technologies and the ways that you can change as such. So if we think about Series 1, we tried to open it really with someone not from the oil and gas industry, someone who's going to help us think through, okay, how is the world looking at us and what's the problem? What are we trying to do?
Yeah.
And Will Day, our first episode we had was fantastic for that because he took that external perspective. He talked us through why is energy important and made it to economic growth in our future, but then identified quite clearly, it's the fossil element of our energy. That's the issue. The greenhouse gas emissions obviously associated with that. That's causing global warming and climate change. And then finally, why 1.5 degrees that we're trying to limit global warming to is so important. So I definitely think it's worth just listening back to that again because it gives us a good reminder as to why we did this series, I guess, in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. And what a great place to start at the start. So let's have a listen back to that very first episode with Will Day.
What are the implications for the energy industry as a whole, and not just oil and gas, but why is it we ultimately need, I guess, an energy transition?
Well, I think one of the reasons why the sector is in the spotlight is the fossil fuel element of energy. I think energy per se is hugely important. We will need and have based our growth of our economies on the use and exploitation of energy. It's the fossil fuel element. It's the greenhouse gas part of that which is the problem. So that's why within the energy sector, oil and gas has been, and coal particularly, has been the focus of attention because the science is pretty undeniable, and the science says that we have over time put much more carbon dioxide equivalent into the atmosphere than is sustainable in the sense of a balance between temperature and the environment. So it's important not just for the energy sector. We've got large chunks of the world's economy which also produces greenhouse gases, but in some ways fossil fuel is the most easily identifiable one.
Okay, and maybe for the listener itself, just to sort of put it into context, as you sort of said there are other elements or other parts of our economy which are also producing carbon or inputting carbon into our atmosphere, which is not helping with the warming of the planet. But is energy sort of the prime driver here in terms of carbon emissions, or is it concrete production, or what are we looking at?
That's why it's kind of inconvenient, because it's the whole economy, David. Actually, if you look at where those emissions come from, they come from fossil fuel, not just the use and burning of it for heating and cooling our houses or buildings, for example, but a third or so of global emissions come from land use and agriculture. So it's not just about moving to electric cars and renewable energy. It's about understanding where these emissions come from and what needs to happen to reduce, minimize them. It's one of the reasons why net zero is emerging as the only really feasible objective for organizations who are in control of their emissions, such as energy users or energy producers.
So that was David talking to Will Day, sustainability consultant, back in May of this year. And David, what a great way to kick off the podcast series from there. After that first episode with Will, did you from the other guests, you started to reference that particular podcast, but what else did you see start to come through those other sessions?
Absolutely no. So there's I guess a response that you see from that opening sort of context setting that we saw, and it's almost sort of best to maybe skip to the end of series 1, because I thought that was the kind of wrap up of a lot of what people were saying in the strategic response of the industry. And that person was Dominic Emery from BP, who kind of talked us through BP's strategy and what was going there. But what Will actually sort of ended on himself was around the risks, right? So what are the risks? There's financial and legal risks that he sees come out for oil and gas companies. And I think BP as such was, certainly through Dominic, explaining the response to that. And Dominic talked about, okay, so if we want to achieve net zero, as Will is saying we should, we need to have an emissions reduction as we saw last year. So through the pandemic, globally, every single year, all the way till we reach net zero in 2050. So it kind of gave you a sense of scale, which I thought was important. But what both of them really ended on, and I think Dominic articulated it really well, and this is, I think, what we should listen to here, is having that optimistic disposition to all of this. You can't have the doom and gloom and sit there and go, this is not possible. In fact, you've got to have an optimistic disposition. If BP have gone in and said we're going to de-risk our core, but then take an optimistic view of the opportunity that's out there. And I think both Will and Dominic really sort of talked about that, and I think that's important for us to focus on. So it's worth listening to that.
Absolutely. Well, let's now jump to the end of Series 1, as David just said, and have a listen to Dominic Emery from BP.
Clearly, it started with Bernard taking over as chief executive at the very beginning of February, and really prior to that, spending time with both our broader stakeholder groups, but also our kind of critics. So people who are going to say, "Well, you guys are simply not moving fast enough. Let's really understand where the kind of the deep challenges are coming from vis-a-vis what our intentions were." So, if you like, a kind of quite a deep listening process with those who would seek for us to go faster and those who would criticise us more kind of dramatically. So that was quite important. I think the second thing was, and then in listening to those critics, also understanding the opportunity of the energy transition. So seeing this as essentially an optimistic exercise. And if you look at be they IEA numbers, be the IRENA numbers, others, the amount of investment that's going to be required to replumb and rewire the world's energy system is phenomenal. So between now and 2050, it's of the order of $100 trillion. So you're looking 30 years, you're looking at $3 trillion a year. So if you're an investor into that opportunity, you're saying, well, bring it on. This is wonderful. So you take an optimistic perspective that this transition creates business opportunities and decarbonization opportunities hand in hand. So I think understanding the kind of the criticism and understanding the opportunity and taking an optimistic disposition towards the opportunity was kind of, these are two big kind of starting points.
So that was Dominic Emery, Chief of Staff to the CEO at BP, talking to David back in July of this year. David, I remember at the end of that podcast, we were talking about the pressure to do more.
Yes.
Through the other series, the two we've run and the other episodes, how do you feel it's come through from other guests in terms of how that's manifested itself?
That's an excellent question. I mean, certainly, you see it now during COP, right? There's always a greater pressure on the oil and gas industry throughout this, and when is enough if enough in that sense. But But you're absolutely right. It was a theme that ran through all the podcasts, really, in terms of how can the oil and gas industry respond to this. And I was quite interested. Iman, we talked about passion. Iman came across from the IGP, came across quite strongly around the misconception around the oil and gas industry, and I thought that was really important. If you're sitting there, I guess defending partly the oil and gas industry and making sure that both sides of the story are told. And Iman was very passionate about that. And also, Joe Coleman from Shell was quite clear to say, that the oil and gas industry needs to be part of the transition, and again, that's a theme that came across in other podcasts. And I would almost say that Julian Perez from OGCI expressed it the best. So he talked about the risk of not including the oil and gas industry. It's not just, you have the right, but actually the risk of not including them. So I think it's worth listening to him as to how he expresses that, because I think it's an appropriate way of thinking about the role of the oil and gas industry through that energy transition.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's do that. This is Julian Perez of the OGCI speaking to David.
Well, the oil and gas industry is directly responsible for roughly 4 gigatons of CO2 equivalent per year. So that's approximately 8% of global greenhouse gas emission. And according to the IEA, accounting for the emission from combustion of the oil and gas products increased this figure to 20. So 42% of the global greenhouse gas emission. So I think that it would be fool to think that you can address climate change without talking about energy transition and about the role the oil and gas has to play in this energy transition. So if we want to be successful at solving the energy transition, we need to have this industry on the table. Energy plays today with every single segment of the economy. It's not only turning the lights or driving a car, it's also producing any goods, any materials, shipping them, delivering them, refrigerating food, allowing access to education. I mean, the energy is really part of every single segment of the economy. And considering the footprint of the oil and gas in the global economy and in the energy system, for me, that's critical that we have to have them around the table. And if I may add something, transforming our relationship with energy means, again, as I mentioned earlier, transforming every single aspect of our way of living. Countries are managing energy as an essential resources, and you have at least one type of energy profile per country. So the oil and gas industry, brings decades of years of experience in the energy market with very deep understanding of the technical aspect of it, the capacity to run long-term projects with high degree of complexity in terms of interaction with other economic sector, international footprint, etc. So believing that the transition will be made only by new entrants is, to me, a risky idea, if not a full idea. So let's benefit from the existing oil and gas company, which are transforming themselves to energy companies, to most of them. They have a long-term experience, presence, capacity to make it happen much more quickly. And the role of the industry is simple. It's to be net zero as soon as possible. So both by working on its own emission and by supporting other sectors in industry, whilst at the same time, of course, continue to deliver the energy needs for the world.
So that was Julian Perez of the OGCI talking to David, episode 3 that was actually. And David, I think what Julian managed to do there was really consolidate and wrap up, not just the sentiment, but some of the practicalities from the OGCI point of view, about how the issues are being dealt with. And he touched on the complexity of it all as well.
Absolutely. I mean, we covered actually quite a wide range of topics. I think it was almost one of our longer ones as well. And I think, clearly highlighted, for example, when you talk about scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions and how you deal with those and what's in scope and out of scope, that argument is not one that's been finalized just yet. And after we did the recording, or soon after at least, OGCI, agreed to a scope 1 and 2 net zero target for all their members, which is great. But that scope 3 is still very much, something you do that's shared with society. And later on, we talked with Joe Coleman as well from Shell, and she had that same and Shell's mantra as well, which is in step with society. And so it is difficult. How do you deal with, scope 1 and 2? Fine, that seems to be something I can control. But scope 3 is, something is, we share that kind of responsibility. So it's an interesting thing because, of course, not everybody agrees with that sentiment.
Of course.
But one of the other sort of practical points he started to come out with was around methane and the reduction of methane. And of course, we've just had the methane reduction initiative signed up to in COP. Yep. So certainly, some large, not all large methane emitters, countries have signed up to this now, and it's a starting process of recognizing that methane leakage is one of the key issues that's causing climate change now. What was then quite, heartwarming and good to see, again, we talk about opportunity and practicality, was when we talked to Clara from Serica Energy as well. And what I liked specifically about hers, which was a little different to the others, was it actually gave us some practical realities around what you can do and how you can achieve it. Now, she gave a flaring example, but so it's worth listening to that. But I think what really came down to was, you can achieve something by being quite specific and clear, and you can have results to show for that very quickly if you just put your mind to it. So it's around the mindset of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And Clara spoke more broadly as well about, attracting and keeping talent and what they need to do as a business. So let's have a listen to Clara Altwell from Serica Energy.
So as you said, ESG is environment, social and governance. And writing an ESG report is a really good way of understanding your company and where it sits in the energy transition and in the world, basically. So the E side, so that environment, so as an oil and gas industry, you look at your impact on the environment and what you can do to change it. So that is by measuring your carbon emissions, measuring your chemical usage, etc., and ensuring you're measuring them correctly, you're reporting them correctly, and you're putting in place actions to actively reduce them. So it's very simple, but you need to do it, and you need to understand the problem before you can solve it. So that's why these ESG reports are really useful. They're not just a burden. So we signed up to the Global Reporting Initiative, GRI, and SASB, which is another sort of sustainable accounting board guidelines, and the UN Global Compact. So we've got the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which are good guidance on how to be a positive company. So looking at the impact on the world that your company has. So once you've got all these sort of metrics in place and frameworks, you could start looking at your company, and that's what we did in 2019. We just transformed. So we'd gone from a very small, very focused company with a handful of people. We acquired the Bruce, Keith and Rum field. So we've got a large platform. We're 100% owners of the Bruce platforms. And we're a sort of a significant operator in the North Sea now. And so as we transformed, doing that exercise, we could look at ourselves and see, right, how are we performing? And what we noticed on the environment side, we were underperforming on our flaring. And so we took steps to address that. And we introduced a flaring philosophy, flaring procedures, and we eliminated a lot of flaring from our activities. And it was purely by recognizing that there was a problem, engaging with our engineers and our control room operators and our offshore staff, and coming up, agreeing a set of guidelines on how we would operate, focusing on daily flare and flaring when you have a shutdown. And then we reduced it by 65% in a year. And it's just by looking at yourself and seeing, like, what can we do to achieve it.
So that was Clara Altwell from Serica Energy, and I think, David, that was probably the first episode where we heard some real practical examples of how carbon emissions can get reduced or at least attempted.
Absolutely. No, it's good to hear it actually being put into practice. Yeah. And Sarah obviously done that very well because they focused and had the right mindset for it. And that was really reinforced, I guess, at the start of Series 2 as well, when we spoke with IO Consulting, Duncan and Safina from IO Consulting, and they gave us really good examples as to how they've done that elsewhere. They've focused on it. If you put your mind to it and you really specifically look at how can you put emissions out of the system as your primary objective, it's perfectly doable with only just a very small cost increase. And so that mindset angle is really an important one.
Okay, well, I think we've got a short clip from that episode. So this is Duncan McLaughlin and Safina Jivraj from IO Consulting. Let's have a listen.
Absolutely, and one of the key takeaways that we had, we applied it to a specific concept, but the methodology can be extrapolated out, and that idea of first principles is key to it all. So when we traditionally approach a study for our clients, we'll work with them to identify the value drivers, what good looks like, and more often than not, those are economic metrics. It's minimize the capex, it's how do we maximize NPV, those type of things. For this study, this net zero study, we constrained ourselves only to focus on the reduction of emissions, and it's very interesting as we were going through our workshop sessions and we were coming up with ideas, and then someone might say, yeah, but that's going to put a lot of cost into it. And then everyone else would jump on them and say, we're not thinking about cost in this, we've got to focus on emissions. So it was absolutely changing the mindset, and it was taking it right back to first principles. And it was a pleasant, I won't say surprise, that's too strong, but really pleasant to find that there was a fairly insignificant increase in the cost, and we purely focused on emissions reduction to achieve that.
So that was Duncan and Safina from IO Consulting, and I think what we heard there was a great bit of insight into the technical and engineering aspects of reducing emissions, certainly from producing assets. But I mean, if we took a step back and said, well, how does that apply, from actually finding, from exploration? And I know, we had Emiliana Rice-Oxley on.
Yes.
But I think there was some great insight in there around partnerships and from that exploration point of view.
Absolutely, yeah. So she covered quite a wide range of different areas, and I thought Emmy was really, really very interesting. And actually, it was the first podcast, and maybe our last, we'll see, where we talked with the two of us. So Graham Bagley, our head of exploration, was on with us as well. Because actually, exploration in one way is the lifeblood of the industry, right? It's where oil and gas ultimately comes from. But what was really interesting from her was certainly in terms of the perspective of net zero and our low carbon future. Yeah. Really, what we were seeing was exploration at its core doesn't need to change, right? It's about safe and being resilient, and as everyone currently is going for the lower cost type barrel. And of course, the new element of that is also trying to achieve a lower carbon barrel. So it's worth just listening to Emiliana, how she sort of summarizes that. Because I think a lot of people believe that, there is maybe an end to exploration right now, but hey, actually exploration still has a future, but it needs to behave in this particular way. So I think Emmy did a really good job of summarizing that.
Yeah, well, let's have a quick listen. So this is Emiliana Rice-Oxley from Petronas from earlier in the year.
Thank you, Graham. It's really great to be talking about exploration now. As I said, Petronas is committed to its long-term exploration strategy with an enhanced focus on Malaysia without impacting its international growth aspirations. What will certainly be different going forward is an enhanced attention to low carbon operations, and not only for exploration, but also development. We recognize that we must be more sustainable to meet societal expectations. So in upstream, very much in line with what I shared earlier, we will focus on being not only a safe, but also a low-cost, low-carbon business. We will improve the efficiency of our operations. We committed to zero flaring by 2030 and zero venting by 2024. And as I said earlier, we will reduce combustion in our oil and gas operations offshore. Now, We've also made a commitment to a monumental project to deploy CCS technology at our Kasawari development, with first injection plan in 2025. And this is part of a greater strategic plan for CCS across depleted gas fields in Malaysia, with a total 46 TCF of storage volume identified. So there's even bigger potential to expand this volume if aquifers and depleted oil fields are considered. So in short, exploration as the upstream growth engine for Petronas will take all these developments that we've been talking about externally into consideration when allocating capital to exploration projects. So when we're talking about our strategy, our exploration strategy was established in 2017 and remain intact to date. We will pursue selective frontier opportunities for material resources. We will explore to fill in Malaysia and regional core and expand our heartlands. And lastly, we are focused and disciplined in execution, leveraging the proven strength of our people and technology in deep water and integrated gas. And over the past years, we have entered the Americas, for example, Mexico, Brazil, US GOM, as well as West Africa. And we've made impactful discoveries in Mexico and US GOM, and earlier this year in Indonesia, which we must bring to production quickly. Now, given the low oil price and the future energy demand that favor cleaner and cheaper energy sources, upstream and exploration need to be competitive. And so to remain important and relevant, because as we move into, say, 2030 or 2050, we just need to be, as I said earlier, a safe, resilient, low cost and low carbon business. So for exploration, the focus on value, lower cost and faster pace, which are really not new, however, are becoming more amplified as the emphasis on lower carbon footprint as we continue to explore and progress on our journey towards energy transition.
So that was Emiliana Rice-Oxley from Petronas speaking to David. And I think David did in that short clip, a really good summary of what things will need to be done differently, but also what things actually are more likely to stay the same. And I think through that podcast, Emmy also touched on partnerships as well.
Absolutely, partnerships is a theme that came across again and again. I think simply because the energy system is changing. But in the case of Petronas, of course, they are looking to explore further afield. They're trying to get new skills on board, and so partnerships were a core part of how they thought about both exploration, but also as a business, as how they grow. And BP's of Dominic, Shell through Joe, and Equinor as well through Greta Thwaite. Each one of them talked about the opportunity of both what I would call collaboration and partnerships to ultimately get things done, but to capture the opportunity. And Dominic spoke, I guess they call it like sectoral decarbonisation, which is really looking up and down the value chain, partnering and getting together and achieving that opportunity. But what I particularly liked from Greta was really some opportunities that she talked about, or should I say case studies, that she talked about what is Equinor doing right now to partner and achieve that opportunity set. And it's not just about Equinor by itself, it's about Equinor partnering and working with others to decarbonise certain sectors. So it's certainly worth listening to a few of those.
Well, let's do that now. So this is Greta Thwaite from Equinor.
But maybe I will focus on the Humber and Teesside region. And maybe to stress that first, we are not in that region by accident. This is the region which is responsible for around 50% of all UK industrial emissions. It is where the major part of our Norwegian gas lands and where our power cables from Dogger Bank will hit shore. And it is the home to large existing gas customers as well. And the key feature in our Humber and Teesside value proposition is what we call the Northern Endurance Partnership, short what we say NEP, a CO2 transport and storage network connecting Teesside and Humber to an extensive CO2 storage area. And we will have the capacity of 27 million tonnes per year. And the CO2 storage is then the basis for our anchor project in Humber. The H2H Salton is what we name it. It's a 600 megawatt blue hydrogen facility, setting up one of UK's oldest chemical parks, the Salton, for fuel switching. And then also we have, together with our long-standing customer SSE, we plan to add a further 1.2 gigawatt of hydrogen production capacity and build 3 low-carbon CCGTs. One called Kidby 2, which will run on a mix of hydrogen and natural gas. Another one called Kidby 3, which will be equipped with post-combustion CCS. And then one called Kidby Hydrogen Power Station, which will run solely on hydrogen and will probably be the first one in the world to do so. And once the infrastructure is built, we then see the potential for the Dogger Bank offshore wind farm to provide electricity for green hydrogen deployment in the same area. And the last project for now in this region is a project we call H21, where Equinor, together with Northern Gas Networks and Cadent, are planning to develop a very large blue hydrogen production facility. And the plan is to convert existing gas distribution pipeline to hydrogen and potentially allowing 40,000 businesses and 3.7 million households access to clean hydrogen.
So that was Greta Tveit from Equinor. David, I think that leads quite well into the technology angle, actually. And one of the first episodes we had in Series 2, this series, was with Kentaro Hosomi from MHI, Mitsubishi Heavy Industries.
Absolutely. No, I mean, it was fantastic to have Kentaro come on and talk about two of the key technologies that Greta referenced herself, CCS and hydrogen, and obviously MHI is a world leader in both of those. And I think it really brought home the fact that, these technologies exist, but it's really about scaling them. And I think that's what, if we sort of turn to the next podcast that came in just after Kentaro's, it was Siobhan Clark from Launchpad, that key question there was, what have you got at your disposal to scale things? And it was really fascinating to hear her talk about the talent and the money that's coming into this industry, or where it's coming from ultimately, to help scale some of these newer technologies as well. Because of course we're going to need all the different technologies we can get our hands on to be able to reach net zero. So it was great to be able to maybe listen to Siobhan now and see what she's got to say about that.
Yeah, let's do that. So this is Siobhan Clark from BP Launchpad.
Let's take a step back to just reflect a little bit about what's been happening in terms of innovation and innovation dollars into the energy transition. So over the last 2 or 3 years, we've seen such an acceleration of deep commitments by governments, by companies in addressing net zero and moving towards that direction. So we've had a sway of people move into that particular space in the last couple of years. The other trend that we're seeing is that the people that have been entrepreneurs who accelerated through cloud software from 2010 onwards, that have exited their businesses, that are now looking and turning around and saying, what's the next biggest problem that I should solve? And they're doing that in the light of, whoa, look at all these deep commitments that have been made. And so people with software backgrounds that have scaled and created enterprise software companies are moving into this particular space and saying, how do I bring software together, software, hardware, digital assets together with energy to solve this net zero issue? And there's a couple of data points, David, just to add into that. I mean, there's something like BNEF says that venture capitalists alone poured something like 17 billion in 2020 into climate-focused companies. By the first half of this year, so in the first 6 months, that had already reached 14 billion. So we're surpassing that, and there's this huge acceleration into that space. And we know that any early stage entrepreneurs, they need funding and support from investors who understand the technologies that are moving from lab to market and their technology readiness levels. They need investors who can break the mold of short investment cycles and really challenge risk profiles. And so we're seeing a very different profile of investor come in to support and scale these growing companies. And so funding is one of those challenges, but it also takes more than that. It's about people, it's about talent, it's about scaling and setting on the shoulders of others.
So that was Siobhan Clark from BP Launchpad. And Siobhan talked a lot there about electrons and the decarbonisation of the power sector, and ultimately intermittency, and what technology may be there now to deal with that in the future. But that, of course, leads pretty well into our most recent podcast with Marek Kubik of Fluence.
Absolutely, yeah. No, so he talked about electron time machines as such that will be part of this electron economy that's going forward, simply because, as you rightly said there, the intermittency of the sector will require these batteries or energy storage systems to be in place. And yeah, he does do a great job, I think, at talking through some of the basics. It's a pretty complicated subject, but I think one area which is maybe talked about beyond the sort of 101 of the world is also the sustainability of the sector, right? We're talking about minerals, we're talking about extraction, manufacturing, all those different things.
Yeah.
How is that appropriate when you're trying to reach a more sustainable world? And what I did like is he responded to that really well and talked through the sustainability and the recycling part of batteries and what that really means. So it's definitely worth having a listen to that as well.
Absolutely. So I'm going to jump to the end now, and this is Marek Kubik of Fluence.
So the market demand based on, EVs is one thing, but also stationary storage need is very, very high based on, if you sort of add up all of the decarbonisation goals and so on and what that means in terms of intermittent renewables on the grid, the need is very clearly there. I would say in the short term, there is a challenge of balancing supply and demand, right? That is extracting quickly and efficiently enough the materials you need to actually make the batteries, in a way that matches that demand, because there's huge uptake of EVs as well. And as we talked about earlier, that's 90% of the market. So, and you see that with certain players in the space. Fluence is pure play energy storage, stationary storage. We don't have any other business lines, but if you have a high margin, high value sort of EV business versus your stationary battery business, you have probably a little bit more of a difficult choice, where if you've got limited supply, are you going to put it in stationary storage or cars? Probably into cars, right? That's sort of the rational outcome, and that slows down then your ability to deliver the infrastructure that's needed on the stationary side of things to transform the grid. So there is a supply demand challenge. It's not a resource challenge per se, because the resource is plentiful. So I do want to dispel that, right? Lithium is an abundant mineral. It's not something that is rare. It's not a rare earth metal or anything like that, just sometimes misunderstood. And actually there's not that much of it in a lithium ion battery by percentage content. It's relatively low. So again, I think there's some misnomer or misunderstanding exactly of what goes into these batteries once they're built. And the second is you take aside the extraction process, because there's a lot of interesting stuff there that's going on to try and make that more efficient and scale and faster. I'm a big techno optimist. I think that's going to be solved and will be solved. At the other end of the spectrum, when you get to end of life, we actually don't at the moment have so many batteries end of life because they last longer than people thought that they would. And so there isn't really a big pile of batteries that need to be recycled. But when you do get to end of life, the recyclable potential is very, very high. Effectively, you can get up to 100%. And some companies really, really focus in on that. We've partnered with Northvolt, as perhaps has been seen in the news. So Northvolt building a European gigafactory and really focused on the whole embodied life cycle of those batteries and how they're made. So making sure that they're being produced using essentially renewable energy, hydro and wind and solar, and then that they're taken back at end of life and incorporated into the new batteries. So at some point, you'll have a large enough mass of sort of materials that are already in the supply chain that you're going to start reusing, and you have to extract less and less of new virgin materials from the ground. So there are challenges in that scale up, and bottlenecks that will come with that. But certainly there's not a shortage in terms of supply overall. So I think this is something that balances out. The danger is that it just means that we decarbonize slower than we would like, or that we would need from a climate crisis perspective.
No, certainly. And one thing I think people often forget, and it's the same in many of these sort of clean tech, we're an early start of a lot of these technologies in terms of scale. The fact that we're thinking about it now rather than when it's already all built is also a big difference, right? So we're actually really thinking about the potential problems and trying to manage and deal with those. And, I do a lot of work on the offshore wind side of things as well. And the fact that we're only, at the very, very start of that industry and already talking about recycling the blades, which is one of the big issues, but talking about that already, that's really quite a step forward versus, maybe other industries that have evolved and not thought about end of life as such and how to deal with that. So.
Yeah, in a way, it's great having the critics to pick at this, because I see all those arguments, and I've seen it as well. For you see these sort of scare articles of like, oh well, it's not renewable at all, then is it? You're throwing these all into landfill, not realizing the stage of the industry is at, and that actually the solutions are being developed to these particular challenges already. So I think actually that sort of disruption and people having an objection to it almost helps. Like it has its challenges, but actually it's really helpful to think about these things earlier so that you actually can solve those problems and challenges. And of course, what we don't talk about so much, just to frame maybe the reverse of this, is often it's easy to point at whatever is new and say, well, that uses raw materials. Well, what in the world doesn't use raw materials, right? You have any traditional industry is using a lot of raw materials to produce whatever it is that is being produced. So it's a bit of a straw man argument to point at any new technology and say, well, this uses resources, because everything does, and it's a case of using them in the most environmentally and socially sustainable ways that you can.
So that was Marek Kubik there, Fluence, and David from intermittency moving to baseload. We also had Jamie Beard on just before Marek, who was talking about geothermal.
Absolutely, and both of them very passionate about their individual subjects. I think Jamie, in particular here, came across someone highlighting, I think, an area that had been forgotten in recent past. Had sort of found its niche, but now could really be, and I think she described it as the future of the oil and gas industry, not just providing sort of baseload power, but actually being the future of the industry itself, which I thought was a fascinating, slightly different view than you maybe hear about geothermal elsewhere. But I think in the next bit we'll probably hear talk more about sort of that bit, but also the passion that came across. So I certainly enjoyed this particular podcast immensely, just because of that passion more than anything else.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Jamie's got a great TED talk as well on geothermal, which is well worth having a listen to.
Absolutely.
So let's have a listen to Jamie Beard on geothermal.
This is a point of nuance that I think folks should really focus on here. In terms of energy transition for oil and gas entities across the board, operators, oil field service, all of it, drilling contract. In talking about energy transition, you often hear this narrative of, oh, well, we're relevant in this space, solar and wind typically, but sometimes others. We're relevant in this space because we know how to scale stuff. We can produce, we know how to build projects. So clearly we can go and help with wind farms, right? And I'm seeing that kind of starting to be applied in geothermal as well. And I think that is completely wrong. Okay, so I think that is just the wrong way to look at this. Because in terms of oil and gas, the interest in geothermal should not be, oh, let's fund startup companies and then we'll help them scale. The interest should be, this is our core competency. We need to just do this, right? So there is no other renewable that fits the bill this way, where you literally engage up and down the chain everybody in oil and gas. Including assets. We're talking about rig workers and rigs, but we're also talking about PhD level geophysicists and geologists and petroleum engineers, everybody from exploration to production, drilling engineering, everything, right? And that goes to the core of these parent companies in terms of capability. And that should be a different discussion. That should not be, oh, let's just help startups scale. That should be, wow, this is a way for us to actually keep our core business model but shift into a clean and renewable energy source. And so I don't think that that's getting enough discussion. It's certainly not being discussed enough in the C-suites of majors, for as far as I can tell. And so, that's why I say I think it's the future of the industry, because I really believe it is. And investing in startups is a good way to start, and it's kind of necessary in terms of risk mitigation a little bit for some of these entities. But at some point, we've got to get to the point where we flip the switch and just start doing it as the business model, because it makes a lot of sense, right? So anyway, that's what I mean when and I realize it's bold, but is it more bold than oil and gas entities becoming wind producers? I mean, I guess when you step back and you look at the alternatives that oil and gas companies are considering, they're literally considering laying off most of their oil and gas related workforce and rehiring people that know how to do solar and wind, and trying to pivot while being on the back foot into areas where there's just not core competency. That's not how you lead, right? You lead with core competency, and geothermal is squarely that.
Jamie Beard there on geothermal. And David, that was actually our last episode in the series too. I thought it was a great way to wrap it up. But I suppose, what next? What's our plans moving forward?
I think the world's your oyster on this one. There's so many different topics to cover, and I think a lot of them have been uncovered as we go through. But I think some of the areas we'd like to explore a little bit more is around the financial side. So how's the finance industry thinking about some of this? But also some of the human elements. So there's the just transition. What does digital really mean in terms of energy, but also human impact on that as well? So be a bunch of other areas, and encourage everyone to reach out and talk to us about what they would like to hear about. But certainly these are some of the things in the pipeline for the next series as well.
Brilliant, great. And thanks for joining me on your podcast.
Pleasure for having me.
So that's it for this episode. This has been a roundup of Series 1 and Series 2. And I just want to say a big thank you to all our guests that have joined David on the Energy Transition Now podcast. It doesn't have to end there, of course. You can head on over to westwoodenergy.com and you'll find Energy Transition across the top. And there were some insights, there's some great explainers about the subjects that we've covered. And of course, you can sign up to receive alerts on when we run new podcasts and the monthly newsletter. So for now, from David, myself, and the Energy Transition team here at Westwood, thanks for joining.